Maximus and the Ghoul thought they were just doing a simple job, a tiny favor in the Wasteland. But nobody told them that one small mistake could turn the whole of Freeside into a disaster zone. Chaos doesn't wait, and neither do they, but sometimes disaster follows faster than anyone can run. Maximus was the kind of man who walked into trouble like it was a friend waiting for him at the door. His confidence was bigger than the Wasteland itself, and he carried a smirk like a weapon sharper than any gun he owned. Everywhere he went, things seemed to fall apart behind him. Though he rarely noticed, he had that reckless charm, the kind that made people either laugh or groan when he showed up. And for him, life was about the thrill of the next explosion, the next gamble, the next crazy plan that might or might not end in chaos. Alongside him was the Ghoul, a creature people often feared or avoided. With skin like cracked stone and eyes glowing with a strange, eerie light, the Ghoul was a survivor, someone who had seen the worst the world could throw at them and lived to tell the story. But unlike Maximus, the Ghoul was cautious, sometimes too cautious, and yet somehow clumsy enough to trip over even the simplest dangers. Together, they were an odd team like fire and dry grass, impossible to control once they started moving. But somehow impossible to separate. The two were wandering through the outskirts of Freeside, a place that had seen better days but still held the energy of a town that refused to die. Shops leaned dangerously, streets were cracked and littered with debris, and people kept their eyes sharp, wary of any trouble that might come from the wasteland beyond. Maximus swaggered ahead, pointing out buildings he claimed they had to check out, though most of the time it was just him looking for an excuse to sneak inside and see what he could loot. The Ghoul followed at a measured pace, muttering sarcastic warnings under their breath about how everything here was fragile and that one wrong move could turn this entire place into rubble. They argued constantly, Maximus laughing at the Ghoul's caution, the Ghoul rolling their glowing eyes at Maximus' brashness. But beneath it all, there was a strange kind of respect. Each needed the other to survive the unpredictable wasteland. Their current mission seemed simple: retrieve an old experimental weapon rumored to be hidden somewhere in the abandoned workshop near the Freeside power hub. To anyone else, it sounded straightforward enough, but Maximus and the Ghoul had a knack for turning simple jobs into disasters. Maximus was already imagining the explosions they could set off, thinking about how impressive it would look when everything went according to his plan. The Ghoul, on the other hand, was already calculating the risk, how many crates were unstable, which floors might collapse, and whether the locals would notice their presence before things got out of hand. The tension between excitement and caution set the stage for what was about to unfold. As they entered the workshop, the atmosphere shifted. Dust floated in streaks through broken windows. The smell of rust and oil hung heavy, and machinery groaned as if warning intruders to leave. Maximus was drawn to the big, ominous lever near the center, a lever that screamed "do not touch," but he ignored it. Naturally, the Ghoul, meanwhile, inched toward a pile of unstable barrels, muttering that someone should probably move these before disaster happened. But Maximus' curiosity and bravado always outpaced the Ghoul's caution. He reached for the lever, thinking he could figure out what it did, while the Ghoul tried to warn him in a hushed voice. Their dialogue bounced between humor and tension, Maximus cracking jokes, the Ghoul snapping back with sarcastic comments, but every word built toward the moment when the first spark would ignite the chaos. They couldn't yet imagine. It was clear from the start that this duo wasn't like the other wanderers of the wasteland. Maximus' reckless energy and the Ghoul's careful clumsiness created a storm in slow motion. Each step they took, each object they moved, seemed insignificant at first. But in the fragile balance of Freeside, even small actions carried enormous consequences. As they explored deeper, picking up strange gadgets, inspecting broken machinery, and joking about the possible rewards, there was a subtle but constant tension in the air. Something was lurking just beyond their perception, a disaster, waiting patiently for the right trigger. They didn't know it yet, but this mission, which started as a simple adventure for treasure and thrills, was the beginning of a chain reaction that would put the entire town at risk. Every glance, every decision, and every laugh carried weight. Maximus was sure they could handle it all. The Ghoul was skeptical. And Freeside? Well, Freeside had no idea what was coming. Maximus and the Ghoul wandered deeper into the workshop, their eyes scanning every corner for the experimental weapon they were supposed to find. What should have been a simple search quickly turned into a comedy of errors, though no one was laughing yet. Maximus spotted a pile of strange, glowing barrels stacked carelessly near the wall, and instead of avoiding them, he decided it looked like a shortcut to reach the lever he wanted to investigate. He nudged one barrel with his boot, and it wobbled dangerously, tipping just enough to make the Ghoul hiss a warning. Careful, that thing could blow us into tomorrow. The Ghoul's voice was sharp, full of both annoyance and fear, but Maximus just laughed, saying, "Relax, it's fine, I've got this." That confidence, as always, was their worst enemy. Every step Maximus took seemed to bend the laws of probability, and every miscalculated move stretched the line between chaos and catastrophe. Meanwhile, the Ghoul tried to follow a methodical path through the workshop, moving slowly around leaking pipes, broken floors, and sparks flying from damaged terminals. But even that careful approach wasn't enough to prevent disaster. A loose floorboard creaked under the Ghoul's weight, sending a small stack of tools crashing into the nearest wall. The clatter echoed through the empty building, and Maximus grinned, as if the noise was a soundtrack to his mischief rather than a warning signal. The tension grew, invisible but thick, wrapping around them like the smoke that began curling from overheated machinery as they approached the back of the workshop. The lever Maximus had been eyeing hummed ominously, almost like it knew what was coming. He stretched out his hand, pretending to test the weight, while the Ghoul muttered that this was probably one of the worst ideas in their lives. But Maximus' curiosity always won over caution. He pulled the lever halfway, and a loud grinding sound echoed as the machinery deep inside the workshop began to move. Sparks jumped from broken wires, and suddenly the barrels Maximus had tipped wobbled even more, sending a few rolling perilously toward a wall covered in exposed pipes and electrical circuits. The Ghoul lunged forward to try to stop them, but tripped on a loose cable, sending themselves sprawling across the floor in the chaos. A small explosion ignited from a stray spark hitting a barrel, throwing a brief burst of fire into the air. Maximus ducked instinctively, laughing at the thrill of it, while the Ghoul scrambled up, cursing and shaking their glowing fists at him. Each small mistake built on the last, like dominoes waiting for the final push. The sounds of groaning metal, falling debris, and warning alarms began to layer together, creating a sense of growing danger that neither of them could ignore for long. It wasn't just the workshop that was fragile. Outside, Freeside itself had its own vulnerabilities, and unknowingly, Maximus and the Ghoul were setting them up to be exploited. The lever they had pulled controlled part of the town's old defense systems, ones that had been left abandoned and unstable for decades. Machinery ground in protest, pipes hissed, and a chain reaction began forming without them even realizing it. Maximus leaned over to inspect another panel, his fingers brushing against a set of wires that sparked under his touch, while the Ghoul warned him that the whole place was like a ticking bomb. But Maximus only smirked, teasing the Ghoul about being too cautious, while secretly feeling the adrenaline of being dangerously close to disaster. Every misstep from barrels rolling, floorboards breaking, wires sparking, two small explosions flickering across the room added tension, and the workshop seemed almost alive, ready to erupt from the weight of their combined recklessness. They laughed at some moments, shouted at each other at others, but beneath all the jokes, the stage for catastrophe was already set. The sense of impending doom grew like a shadow stretching across the town, even if they couldn't see it yet. By the time they reached the end of the workshop, their simple mission had become a sequence of dangerous near misses. Sparks flew into old oil containers, wires hissed with electricity, and Maximus' curiosity about every switch, lever, and button meant that each action they took nudged Freeside closer to a chain reaction. The ghoul, exhausted and frustrated, realized that no amount of careful planning could counteract Maximus' instinct to push everything to the edge. They tried to suggest retreating, warning that the whole town could be in danger. But Maximus, caught up in the thrill, ignored the caution. With a final mischievous grin, he fiddled with a large, unstable machine at the center of the room, unaware that the vibrations were loosening a critical support beam above. While the ghoul groaned and muttered darkly under their breath, realizing that they had officially crossed the line from adventure to accidental destruction, the workshop, once quiet. The moment the first explosion erupted, Freeside's fragile calm shattered like glass under a hammer. Sparks from the workshop ignited a chain reaction, sending fire licking across wooden beams. Oil-soaked floors and old barrels stacked in precarious towers. Maximus froze for a brief second, eyes wide, almost enjoying the spectacle, before instinctively ducking as another blast threw debris into the air. The ghoul scrambled desperately to contain the damage, slamming into doors, flipping over tables, and trying to grab anything that could slow the inevitable destruction. But every action seemed to make it worse. Outside the workshop, the people of Freeside had no warning. Shops exploded, shouts filled the air, and the streets turned into a chaotic maze of collapsing walls and flying debris. Raiders, merchants, and wanderers all ran for cover as smoke and dust swallowed the familiar landmarks of their town. Maximus' excitement and the ghoul's frantic movements collided in a symphony of chaos, each mistake triggering another disaster. A support beam snapped under the vibration of multiple explosions, falling onto a cart of barrels, which in turn rolled into a street market, igniting lanterns and sending flames racing toward nearby buildings. Civilians screamed, throwing whatever they could to save themselves or slow the fire, while Maximus and the ghoul, still inside the workshop, were barely keeping themselves from being caught in their own mess. Every corner of Freeside seemed to groan and creak as the destruction spread. Windows shattered, walls cracked, and the ground shook under the weight of multiple simultaneous fires. Maximus, who had initially been laughing, now realized the scale of what they had caused, though he couldn't help smirking nervously at the spectacle of chaos they had unleashed. The ghoul, eyes wide with horror, tried to direct him toward a safer exit, pointing at structural weaknesses that could collapse at any second. But the timing of their missteps was perfect in the worst way possible. Every failed attempt to correct their mistake sent sparks into oil barrels, which ignited additional fires, which in turn caused the unstable wiring of the workshops machinery to short-circuit, producing showers of electric sparks and small blasts that echoed like gunfire across the town. The heat was suffocating, the smoke blinding, and yet somehow, in the middle of the chaos, Maximus and the ghoul kept moving, dodging debris and shouting at each other over the roar of destruction. Outside, the streets became impossible to navigate. People tripped over rubble, animals bolted into alleys, and the familiar sounds of Freeside market chatter, horses' hooves, and casual arguments were replaced with screaming, crashing, wood, and explosions that rattled every wall. Each second of delay magnified the destruction, and it became clear that no simple action could stop it now. The fire began spreading to the neighboring shops and homes, climbing walls with almost unnatural speed, as if the town itself were reacting to their presence. Punishing them for their reckless interference, Maximus, in a rare moment of seriousness, tried to focus on stopping the spread, but every machine he fiddled with seemed to betray him, responding with ladder bangs or hissing steam that sent him and the ghoul scrambling. The ghoul tried to drag him toward the exit, muttering curses and panicked suggestions, but the heat, smoke, and flying debris made every step a gamble. Explosions erupted in waves, first in the workshop, then in the adjoining streets, and finally, in the market square. Freeside's residents ran through the streets, some helping others, most simply trying to survive, while Maximus and the ghoul continued their frantic dance inside the building, unaware of exactly how close they were to being buried under collapsing walls. As the destruction escalated, the town's power hub, already unstable, began to fail catastrophically. Sparks jumped from overloaded circuits, shorting out lights and causing alarms to wail like the cries of the frightened townsfolk. Fires spread through the wooden walkways, licking the sides of buildings, while debris rained down from above. Maximus and the Ghoul, exhausted and singed by smoke and heat, finally realized that their actions had set off a perfect storm of chaos. The town, once vibrant with life and color, was now a scene of near-apocalyptic devastation, and yet, amid all the collapsing buildings, flying debris, and panicked citizens, there was still a strange, grim humor in how completely they had managed to destroy everything unintentionally. Maximus looked around, eyes wide and sweaty, and even he had to admit it, Freeside would never look the same again. The Ghoul, trembling but still trying to maintain some sense of order, muttered darkly about how this was exactly why we never touch anything, as the smoke and flames enveloped them, signaling that the full extent of their accidental destruction had only just begun. The dust finally began to settle, though the air remained thick with smoke, ash, and the acrid scent of burned wood and oil, leaving Freeside barely recognizable. Streets were littered with rubble, market stalls were nothing more than smoldering ruins, and the once bustling alleys were now eerily quiet except for the occasional crack of collapsing beams or the groan of damaged structures. Maximus stumbled out of the workshop, coughing and squinting through the smoke, his clothes singed and streaked with grime. The Ghoul followed closely, their glowing eyes scanning the devastation with a mixture of horror and disbelief. The full weight of what they had caused pressed down on them as they moved through the wreckage. Shops that had survived decades of raiders, storms, and the harsh wasteland weather had crumbled in minutes under their accidental influence. The townsfolk emerged cautiously from hiding, many limping, others carrying whatever belongings they could salvage from the ruins. Panic had turned into despair as residents realized the extent of the destruction. Raiders and opportunists already began prowling the streets, as glinting as they took stock of the chaos for potential gain, while frightened families huddled together, unsure if they could rebuild from the smoldering remains of their homes. Maximus, who had been the first to laugh at the chaos, now felt a sinking pit in his stomach, though a part of him still couldn't resist making a nervous joke about how spectacularly they had managed to leave their mark on Freeside. The Ghoul, shaking their head, glared at him and muttered that nothing was funny, their voice carrying the weight of someone who had just witnessed a preventable disaster. The pair tried to assess the situation, realizing that the chain reaction they had set in motion didn't just destroy buildings, it had crippled the town's infrastructure. The power hub was smoking and sparking uncontrollably, cutting electricity to the streets, alarms, and water pumps. Fires still flickered in hidden pockets, threatening to ignite remaining structures. The smell of burning oil and wood lingered, and radiation warnings began beeping from devices left exposed in the ruins. Maximus attempted to help, moving debris and trying to reach survivors, while the Ghoul organized a few able-bodied townsfolk to prevent further collapse and contain lingering fires. Despite their efforts, the scale of the destruction made it almost impossible to control. As they worked, the reality of the chaos weighed heavier. Freeside would not recover quickly, and many lives had been altered forever by a series of accidents that began with a simple curiosity and a few missteps. The townsfolk began murmuring among themselves, some angry, others grieving, and a few too stunned to respond, while Maximus and the Ghoul struggled to process the enormity of their actions. For every person they helped, another problem arose: walls teetering dangerously, trapped animals crying, or flammable debris threatening to reignite fires. The sense of helplessness pressed down like the dust in the air, and Maximus, normally so full of reckless confidence, found himself questioning every choice that had led them here. Meanwhile, the Ghoul, despite their frustration and fear, quietly recognized that their survival instincts had kept them both alive, though survival alone didn't erase the devastation. Even as they moved through the ruins, A strange quiet settled over Freeside, a temporary lull that allowed them to see the full impact: collapsed buildings, ruined markets, and frightened survivors staring at them with a mixture of accusation, confusion, and hopelessness. Every glance seemed to say the same thing: how could this happen? And the truth was, they hadn't meant for any of it. But intent mattered little in the face of consequences this massive. The surrounding areas weren't safe either. Fires were spreading toward outskirts, radiation hotspots were forming from damaged equipment, and the once vibrant town had become a dangerous wasteland almost overnight. Maximus and the Ghoul trudged through the streets, helping when they could, but the weight of responsibility pressed on them like never before. They had set Freeside on a path of near-total collapse. And though some hope remained in rebuilding, the scars of their accidental destruction would linger for years. Even the raiders, opportunistic as they were, paused at the scale of what had happened. Realizing that this disaster wasn't ordinary chaos, it was an unprecedented collapse caused by too unlikely wonder. Ours who had unknowingly rewritten the fate of the town. As night fell, casting long shadows over the ruins, Maximus and the Ghoul finally stopped to catch their breath, surveying the aftermath. The fires still burned. The air shimmered with heat and dust, and the moans of injured and trapped townsfolk echoed faintly through the streets.